I was halfway through flipping pancakes on a lazy Saturday morning when the doorbell rang like an emergency alarm. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe a delivery or a neighbor needing a jump start, but when I opened the door and saw Karen Matthews standing there, arms crossed, sunglasses perched like a crown of judgment, I knew this wouldn't be pleasant. Her voice was clipped and sharp, every syllable soaked in disapproval. "Your children were screaming in the yard for 20 minutes yesterday," she said. "Some of us work from home and value peace and quiet." I blinked, still holding the spatula. My kids had been outside playing tag with the neighbors, laughing, not screaming, and it wasn't even past 6 in the evening. I started to respond, but she cut me off. "If it happens again, I'll be forced to report it to the HOA. Repeated noise violations can result in fines, you know." And with that, she spun on her heel and marched back across the cul-de-sac to her perfectly trimmed lawn and aggressively beige house. I stood there, stunned, the smell of burnt pancake drifting from the kitchen behind me. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the sheer pettiness of it all, of all the things to complain about, children playing. But I didn't say anything. Not yet. Not until the next morning when her dog, a fluffy white thing named Muffin, barked non-stop at a squirrel for a solid 20 minutes at 6:30 a.m., while she stood on her porch, sipping coffee like nothing was wrong. That's when it clicked. If she wanted to play the noise complaint game, I could play too, only the difference was I was better at it. 2 days later it showed up in our mailbox, like a slap in the face, an official notice from the Pine Hills HOA citing our household for excessive noise disturbances. The paper was stiff, formal, and packed with bureaucratic language, but the message was crystal clear. Due to multiple complaints from a concerned neighbor, our property had been flagged for violating the community's quiet hours, and any further infractions could result in a fine or even disciplinary action from the board. I read the letter twice, then a third time trying to make sense of it. My kids were 9 and 11. They played tag, rode bikes, laughed a little too loud sometimes, but it wasn't like we were throwing ragers. They were outside in the late afternoon, never at night, and never unsupervised. My jaw clenched as I realized this wasn't just a warning. It was a direct shot fired by Karen. The way she'd marched up to my door, the smugness in her tone, the thinly veiled threat. She'd gone through with it. She actually reported us. I showed the letter to my husband that evening, and he just shook his head, muttering something about power-hungry people with too much time. We figured it was a one-time thing. Maybe if we kept our heads down, she'd get bored, but that was wishful thinking. The very next weekend, while my kids played a quiet game of catch in the driveway, I caught Karen on her porch with her phone pointed straight at them, recording. She didn't say a word, just stood there, filming with that expressionless, robotic look like she was collecting evidence for a trial. That night, another complaint. Then another. The HOA sent an email saying they'd received multiple reports from a concerned neighbor regarding disruptive child behavior and reminded us of our responsibility to maintain a peaceful environment. It was surreal. My children had become suspects in some bizarre suburban court where laughter was a crime. I wanted to scream. Instead, I started documenting everything, dates, times, what the kids were doing, even decibel readings from an app on my phone. If she wanted to turn this into a legal chess match, I was going to come armed with facts. But deep down, I knew this wasn't about noise. It was about control. Karen had chosen her target, and now she was tightening the screws. What she didn't realize was that she'd picked a family that knew how to push back, and the next time Muffin so much as yapped at a butterfly, I'd be ready. Karen liked to present herself as the guardian of peace and order in our neighborhood, but anyone who actually lived near her knew that title should have gone to Muffin, her tiny yappy dog. With the personality of a malfunctioning car alarm, Muffin barked at everything, and I mean everything. The wind, the mail truck, a leaf falling from a tree, its own reflection in the window. It was like living next to a furry siren that went off at random hours day and night. The irony was almost poetic. Here was Karen lecturing me about noise pollution, while her dog turned every sunrise into a canine opera. It got to the point where I could set my watch by it. 6:30 in the morning, bark, bark, bark. Noon, bark, bark, bark. Sunset, bark, bark with dramatic flair. And what did Karen do? Nothing. She'd just stand there in her fancy robe, sipping from a coffee mug that said good vibes only, like Muffin was serenading the heavens instead of disrupting every living soul within a 5-house radius. The first few times I tried to be civil. I mentioned it lightly while passing by. "Muffin sure has a lot to say lately," I said with a smile. Karen didn't even look at me. "Dogs will be dogs," she replied flatly, and walked back inside. That was her entire philosophy, apparently. Rules were for everyone else. The kicker came one night when Muffin had some sort of emotional breakdown over a passing raccoon and barked non-stop for 47 minutes. I timed it, 47 minutes. Not one break, not one pause. My windows were closed, my white noise machine was on, and I still couldn't sleep. The next morning Karen had the nerve to glare at me like I was the problem. That was the moment something inside me snapped. She'd built this little fortress of fake perfection and self-opinionated authority, but her walls were paper thin, and I had the receipts. I dug through the HOA bylaws, and there it was, in bold plain language. Section 9.4. Persistent pet noise exceeding 10 minutes is subject to citation upon documented proof. Documented proof. Oh, I could document the hell out of Muffin. I set up a camera in my front window with audio capture. I downloaded a noise monitoring app that timestamped everything. I started a log with notes, dates, and exact durations. Every time that dog opened its yap, I hit record. Karen had no idea that every bark was now becoming ammunition, and the moment I had enough, I was going to fire the first shot right back. The final straw came on a Thursday evening when Karen called security on us because my daughter was singing along to a Taylor Swift song while helping me clean out the garage. It was barely 7:15, the sun was still up, and the music was playing off a Bluetooth speaker at normal volume. But according to Karen, it was a public disturbance. The HOA emailed us again, this time with a formal warning and a passive-aggressive reminder that repeat offenses could lead to disciplinary hearings. That was it. I had played nice long enough. I printed out every note I'd taken over the past 3 weeks, every bark from Muffin logged with timestamps, audio clips, and video files. I assembled a digital report so thorough it would have made a private investigator jealous. Then I filed my first official noise complaint. I submitted everything through the HOA portal, no anonymous whispers, no hiding, just my name in bold letters and the subject line, "Barking Dog Ongoing Disturbance." The next morning I watched from behind my blinds as Karen retrieved her mail and pulled out the familiar white envelope. She read it, froze, and for the first time since she moved in, her smug expression cracked. I thought that might be the end of it, but no. Muffin kept barking, and I kept filing. Every incident became a documented offense, complete with evidence. Within 10 days I had filed 6 complaints, and each one met the HOA requirement for a review. It felt like poetic justice. The very rules she tried to weaponize against me were now turning against her. I wasn't just defending my kids anymore, I was building a case, and Karen had no idea just how far I was willing to take it. It didn't take long for the complaints to start piling up against Karen, and by the end of the second week she received her 3rd formal citation for Muffin's non-stop barking. That's when things escalated. One afternoon I caught her standing in her yard, fake watering her already drenched hydrangeas while glaring daggers at my front door. She wasn't subtle about it either. The next morning my trash can was mysteriously knocked over and smeared with what looked like dog waste. Coincidence, maybe? But then came the HOA email stating they'd received a report that my property was in unsanitary condition due to neglected garbage. It was almost laughable, if it weren't so obviously retaliatory. I responded with a photo of our perfectly bagged trash taken 5 minutes before it was dumped and suggested they review my camera footage. I didn't hear back. That same week, a new complaint was filed against me, claiming our backyard playset was too tall and intrusive, even though it had been there for 3 years with no issue. My kids were starting to notice. They asked why Karen didn't like us and if they had done something wrong. That was the worst part. Not the trash or the complaints, but the fact that my kids were starting to feel like criminals for just being kids. That was when I decided this wasn't just about barking or singing or who had the loudest stereo on a Sunday afternoon. It was about power and someone who thought she could control the entire neighborhood through fear and petty intimidation. But what Karen didn't count on was the fact that I wasn't the only one keeping score. A few neighbors started reaching out, quietly at first, a nod at the mailbox, a whispered complaint during a dog walk. Then, more boldly, Mrs. Ellis from 2 houses down told me Karen had reported her for having unauthorized seasonal decorations when she put up a fall wreath before October. Mr. Green got a citation because his teenage son parked his car half an inch onto the grass, and the clincher came when a neighbor I barely knew stopped by with a copy of his own noise complaint filed by Karen because his toddler cried too loudly during bath time. That was when I knew this wasn't just a feud between me and Karen, this was a pattern. And I wasn't the only one tired of being pushed around. I started a group chat with a few neighbors and we shared stories, timelines, even documentation. What emerged was a clear picture. Karen had spent the past year bullying half the street with bogus complaints using the HOA as her personal weapon. But now the target was shifting. She thought she was untouchable, hiding behind rules and fake concern, but she forgot one simple truth: you can only push people so far before they start pushing back. By the end of the month, the group chat had grown from 5 people to nearly half the block, and what started as a quiet exchange of frustrations quickly turned into a full-scale investigation. Everyone had a story. Everyone had a receipt. Karen had filed over 30 individual complaints in the past 6 months alone, all targeting families with kids or young couples, or anyone who dared to break her unspoken code of neighborhood conduct. Has become a self-appointed enforcer, twisting the HOA rules into weapons and using them to silence and control. But now we had the numbers, and more importantly, we had the proof. That's when Mark, the guy who lived across the street and worked in IT, dug up something we didn't expect. Karen wasn't just a bored busybody, she was actually on the HOA's internal complaint review committee. She wasn't just filing the complaints, she was helping process and approve them. It was a clear conflict of interest and probably a violation of HOA governance policy. We cross-referenced the timestamps on her complaints and realized she'd often filed them and then reviewed them herself less than 48 hours later, pushing them through the system before anyone could challenge them. It was subtle but deliberate. That's when things started to click. Her own violations, like Muffin's barking or the fact that her boyfriend parked his oversized truck in a red zone every weekend, had mysteriously never made it into official records. Karen had weaponized the HOA and rigged it to protect herself while punishing anyone who didn't fit her mold of quiet suburban perfection. We knew we had to act, but it couldn't just be angry emails or passive protest. We needed something formal, something undeniable. So I reached out to another neighbor, Jessica, whose aunt happened to be a paralegal. With her help, we drafted a petition to request a special HOA meeting for the purpose of reviewing Karen's conduct and potential violations of ethics and governance. To call the meeting, we needed signatures from 30% of homeowners. We got 42% in 3 days. People were ready. They were done hiding behind their blinds, pretending not to see what was happening. On the day of the meeting, Karen showed up wearing a blazer and that same icy smile she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. She walked in like she owned the place, totally unaware that nearly every person in the room had a folder in their lap. Inside those folders were copies of her complaints side by side with video evidence and witness statements directly contradicting them. There were logs of Muffin barking security cam footage of her trespassing to measure lawn height, and even one recording of her loudly mocking a neighbor with disabilities during a phone call she thought no one heard. When the moderator opened the floor for community concerns, I stood up first and read my statement calmly, clearly, and backed by evidence. I detailed how Karen had filed false reports, retaliated against families who spoke up and failed to disclose her position on the complaint committee. Then came the others. One by one they stood up and spoke. Mr. Green, Jessica, Mark, Mrs. Ellis. Each voice added to the storm, each story hammering another nail into the coffin of her credibility. Karen's smile faded by the second. She tried to interrupt, tried to argue, but the room was no longer hers. The final blow came when Mark displayed a flowchart on the projector showing how over 90% of fines and citations in the past year had originated from or been pushed through by Karen. That was the tipping point. The moderator called for a motion to suspend Karen from all HOA duties pending an external ethics review, and the vote passed almost unanimously. For the first time since she moved in, Karen Matthews looked genuinely stunned, and for the first time since this war began, the neighborhood felt like ours again. The night of the HOA meeting, the community center parking lot was completely full, and the buzz in the air was electric. Normally these meetings drew maybe 6 or 7 retirees bored enough to care about lawn regulations, but Tonight people were pouring in, standing shoulder to shoulder, even crowding the back wall. You could feel it. Something big was coming. Karen walked in like she always did, head high, blazer pressed, face tight with control, but this time her smile felt forced. She scanned the room and for the first time seemed to realize she wasn't among allies. The moderator opened with the usual formalities, but no one cared about the treasurer report or landscaping updates. When he finally reached the agenda item titled Community Grievances, a hush fell over the room. I stood up slowly, folder in hand, and cleared my throat. "My name is Daniel Reyes, and I am a homeowner on Maplewood Lane," I said, "and I'd like to bring forward a formal concern about patterns of selective enforcement and abuse of authority by a member of this board." Karen's smile twitched slightly, her hands clenched at her sides. I proceeded to list dates of false complaints submitted by Karen against my family, each paired with a photo, video clip, or a neighbor's witness statement. Then I presented the HOA's own bylaws highlighting the conflict of interest that arises when a complaint committee member files and reviews their own reports. That was just the beginning. One by one, neighbors began standing up, sharing their own stories. Mr. Green spoke about his son being targeted for parking a foot over the curb. Jessica told the room about being fined for a front door wreath. Mrs. Ellis tearfully described Karen's repeated complaints that caused her to take down every bit of holiday decor she used to put up for her late husband. And then Mark stepped forward with the bombshell. He connected his laptop to the projector and brought up a slide showing complaint records. Over 90% of citations in the past 8 months originated from or were approved by Karen. That number by itself was damning, but it was the next slide that stunned the room. A map of the neighborhood color-coded by citations. Karen's street and her close friends had almost none, while the rest of us were lit up like Christmas. The pattern was undeniable. Karen's voice finally cut through the noise. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "These people are clearly conspiring against me. I've done nothing but try to uphold the standards of our community." The moderator tried to calm things, but the room was already boiling over. Someone shouted, "What about the video of you trespassing on the Myers lawn?" Karen turned red. "What video?" Then Mark clicked again, and there it was. Grainy footage from a Ring camera showing Karen bending down in someone's yard, tape measure in hand, while muttering to herself. The moderator raised a hand and called for order. "Given the seriousness of these claims and the volume of supporting evidence, I move that we suspend Karen Matthews from all HOA board responsibilities, effective immediately, pending an independent audit and ethics review." He looked around. "All in favor?" Hands shot up like a tidal wave. Karen's face was frozen in disbelief. Only 2 hands remained down, hers and Diane's, the only ally she had left. The vote passed. Karen stood there unmoving, lips parted like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. As the crowd began to murmur and shift, she finally gathered her things and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking like a metronome of defeat. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. And we'd finally gotten a piece of it. I thought it was over after the meeting, thought Karen would slink away into the shadows, maybe even put her house up for sale and disappear like a bad memory, but I should have known better. 2 days later, a letter arrived from the County Animal Control Office addressed to me, claiming an anonymous report had been filed alleging mistreatment of a pet on our property. The kicker was we did not own a pet, not even a goldfish. I called the office and the woman on the phone was polite but firm. An investigation had to be opened due to the nature of the complaint. I knew immediately it was Karen, her last desperate attempt to hit back now that her HOA power was gone. But this time she went too far. Filing false complaints with the HOA was one thing, but submitting a fraudulent report to a government office was another. I gathered every piece of documentation I had and contacted a lawyer through a family friend. Meanwhile, neighbors began texting me screenshots from the HOA portal. Apparently, Karen had tried to retroactively erase several of her own complaint records and even flagged multiple posts in our group forum calling them harassment. Her behavior was spiraling fast. Then came the moment that changed everything. Late one night, I was reviewing our security footage, just making sure nothing else weird had happened, and there it was, Karen and Diane, sneaking through my side yard around 2 a.m, carrying something that looked like a garden gnome. A few minutes later, the same gnome appeared, smashed on my back patio, followed by a second animal control complaint the next day, this time claiming we had aggressive dogs on the property. I had it all on video. With my lawyer's help, I submitted the footage and copies of her complaint history to the local authorities. Within 48 hours, Karen was under investigation not just by the HOA auditors, but by the sheriff's office for filing false reports and trespassing. The story broke on our community Facebook page first, then local news picked it up. Karen Matthews, former HOA board member under formal investigation for abuse of authority and harassment. It was surreal watching it unfold like a movie, twist after twist, but what stuck with me most was the shift in the neighborhood. People started smiling again, stopping to chat in driveways, kids playing freely without someone filming them from behind a curtain, and as for me, I slept better, knowing the worst was behind us, and the last shot Karen ever tried to fire had backfired completely. A week after the story broke, Karen's house went dark, blinds drawn, curtains closed, no sign of Muffin barking at squirrels or mail trucks, just silence. Then one morning, a moving truck appeared parked in her driveway for hours as boxes were loaded by men who avoided eye contact with anyone walking by. Karen never came out, not once, not even to say goodbye. By sunset, she was gone, leaving behind only a wilted flower bed and a neighborhood that finally exhaled. But the story didn't end there. The HOA held a special election 2 weeks later, and for the first time, every seat was contested and every vote counted. Mr. Green was elected president. Jessica took over communications, and even Mrs. Ellis joined the board after years of saying she never would. The first order of business? Rewrite the community guidelines with real clarity and fairness. No more vague noise rules or ridiculous fines for wreaths and wind chimes. More importantly, a new rule was passed preventing any one person from serving on multiple enforcement committees at once, the exact loophole Karen had used to dominate the system. But the moment that hit me hardest came at the first community block party since before Karen moved in. Tables lined the sidewalks, music played, kids rode scooters up and down the street, and laughter filled the air. Without fear of complaint, I stood on my driveway, holding a plate of ribs, watching my daughter play tag barefoot and free, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I had to look over my shoulder. People came up to thank me, some I barely knew, shaking my hand, offering beers, saying things like, "You stood up when no one else could, and we owe you one." But it wasn't about being the hero. It was about drawing a line, about proving that no matter how loud someone barks, they can't drown out a community that's united. And as the sun dipped below the trees, casting gold across the street finally at peace, I realized something funny. If Karen hadn't filed that first noise complaint, none of this would have happened. We'd all still be living in fear of the next citation, the next knock on the door. Instead, we had taken our neighborhood back, and it was louder, brighter, and better than ever.